Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is something deeply unsettling about a predator that knows fear. In the cold and endless reaches of the void between stars, where the light of distant suns barely manages a faint whisper against the blackness, there drifts the greatest hunger the galaxy has ever known. The Tyranids, the great devourer, a biological nightmare stretching across light years of empty space, driven by a single imperative so primal and so absolute that it has consumed entire civilizations, entire ecosystems, entire worlds, stripped down to bare rock and left as nothing more than pale, lifeless husks spinning quietly in the dark. The Tyranids do not negotiate. They do not bargain. They do not make treaties or entertain diplomacy. They are hunger-given form, and 1,000,000,000,000,000 organisms bound together under the direction of a psychic intelligence so vast and so alien that even the briefest contact with it has driven human minds to permanent madness. Every tendril of every hive fleet moves with purpose, guided by the cold and calculating awareness of the hive mind, a gestalt consciousness that perceives the galaxy not as a place of wonder or mystery, but as a feeding ground. A banquet hall stretching from one edge of creation to the other, filled with biomass waiting to be consumed, catalogued, broken apart at the molecular level, and reconstituted into new organisms designed to consume even more. And yet, there are places in this galaxy that the Tyranids will not go. Not because they cannot, not because some barrier of physics or distance prevents them from reaching these worlds, but because somewhere deep within the unfathomable calculations of the hive mind, a decision is made. A cold and alien form of recognition flickers through the synaptic web that connects every organism in the swarm, and the tendrils of the hive fleet shift. They bend, they curve away like a river meeting a stone too large to erode, and they find another path, another world, another feast. The worlds they avoid belong to the necrons. This is a fact that has puzzled Imperial scholars, xenobiologists of the Ordo Xenos, and every student of the Tyranid menace who has ever tried to map the seemingly chaotic paths of the great hive fleets. Because the Tyranids, by every measure of their behavior, across thousands of documented engagements, do not avoid anything. They do not retreat from orc warbands howling their savage battle cries across burning plains. They do not flinch from the massed batteries of Imperial Navy warships, lighting up the void with lance fire and torpedo salvos. They do not turn aside from the flickering sorceries of chaos warbands or the elegant, deadly precision of Aeldari war hosts. The Tyranids adapt. They consume. They overcome. That is their nature and their purpose, written into every strand of genetic code, across every bioform, from the smallest ripper to the largest biotitan. But when a tendril of a hive fleet approaches a Necron tomb world, something different happens. Something that, if the Tyranids were capable of such a thing, you might almost call caution. You might almost call it fear. Tonight, we are going to explore one of the most fascinating and chilling relationships in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. We are going to talk about why the Great Devourer, the single most voracious and unstoppable biological force in the known galaxy, consistently and deliberately avoids the ancient worlds of the Necrons. We will trace this behavior back through codex entries, through campaign narratives, through the deep history of both species, and through the cold logic that governs the hive mind's decisions. We will look at the technology that makes Necron worlds so dangerous, the absence of biomass that makes them so unappealing, the psychic interference that makes them so disorienting, and the deeper cosmic implications of what it means when two of the galaxy's greatest existential threats recognize each other across the void. So settle in. Oh, get comfortable. Let the ambient hum of the void ships carry you along as we drift into the deep lore, into the ancient history of empires that rose and fell before humanity's distant ancestors had even crawled from the primordial oceans of old Earth. This is the story of the hunger that met the machine, and what happened when it decided to look the other way. Let us begin, as we must, with the hunger itself. Because to understand why the Tyranids avoid Necron worlds, you first need to understand what drives the Tyranids to consume everything else, and that means understanding the hive mind. The hive mind is not a brain, it is not a single organism sitting somewhere in the depths of space, issuing orders to its minions like some vast biological general. It is something far stranger and far more terrifying than that. The hive mind is a gestalt consciousness, a collective intelligence formed from the combined psychic presence of every Tyranid organism in existence. Every ripper swarm gnawing through the roots of alien forests, every gaunt scuttling across a burning battlefield, every warrior synapse creature standing like a biological relay tower amidst the chaos of combat, every bioship drifting through the cold void between stars. All of them contribute to the hive mind. All of them are part of it, and the hive mind is part of all of them. Imagine, if you can, a mind so vast that it encompasses trillions upon trillions of individual organisms spread across thousands of light years. A mind that perceives the galaxy not through eyes or ears or any single sensory organ, but through the combined input of every tendril of every hive fleet currently in motion. It sees through the compound eyes of genestealers lurking in the bowels of space hulks. It tastes the chemical composition of atmospheres through the sensory organs of spore mines, drifting through planetary defenses. It feels the electrical impulses of prey species through the synaptic web of its warrior organisms. And through all of this input, all of this data flowing in from every corner of its vast domain, the hive mind makes decisions. Not conscious decisions in the way that humans understand them. The hive mind does not sit down and weigh options, does not debate strategy with advisors, does not wrestle with moral implications or political consequences. Its decision-making process is something far more fundamental. It is instinct, refined to perfection over millions of years of evolution, filtered through a psychic intelligence that has consumed the genetic information of entire galaxies. When the hive mind decides to send a tendril of a hive fleet toward a particular world, that decision is the product of an incomprehensibly complex calculation involving the biomass available on that world, the resistance likely to be encountered, the energy cost of the invasion, the genetic diversity of the planet's biosphere, and 1,000 other variables that no human mind could hope to process simultaneously. The Tyranids exist for one purpose: consumption. Every organism in the swarm, from the microbes that break down organic matter in the digestion pools to the massive hive ships that serve as the fleet's vanguard, is designed and engineered for the efficient acquisition and processing of biomass. When a hive fleet descends upon a world, the process is methodical and thorough. Vanguard organisms make planetfall first, sowing terror and disrupting the planet's defenders. Genestealers have usually been at work for generations before the fleet even arrives, infiltrating the population, establishing cults, and weakening the world from within. Then come the main swarms, gaunts by the millions, warriors by the thousands, monstrous creatures the size of battle tanks and larger, all descending upon the planet's surface in a tide of chitin and claw and acid. The defenders fight and they kill, sometimes in enormous numbers, but every Tyranid organism that falls in battle is itself biomass that the swarm can reclaim. And every defender that falls provides additional resources for the swarm to consume. The mathematics of a Tyranid invasion are brutally simple. As long as the biomass gained from conquering a world exceeds the biomass expended in taking it, the invasion is a net positive for the hive fleet. This is the key to understanding everything that follows. The hive mind is, at its most fundamental level, an accountant. A cosmic bookkeeper of biological resources, constantly running a profit and loss calculation across the entire galaxy. It expends biomass to create invasion organisms. Those organisms consume biomass on the target world. The consumed biomass is broken down, processed, and fed back into the fleet, where it is used to create more organisms, fuel further travel, and grow the fleet's overall mass and capability. Well, when the calculation comes back negative, when the cost of taking a world exceeds the biomass that world can provide, the hive mind adjusts. It redirects. It finds a target where the numbers work out better. This is not fear. It is not caution in the emotional sense. It is optimization. Pure, cold, biological optimization operating on a galactic scale. And this is where the Necrons enter the equation. Because Necron worlds represent, by almost every metric the hive mind uses to evaluate potential targets, the worst possible return on investment in the entire galaxy. But to understand why, we need to understand what the Necrons actually are and what their worlds look like to a mind that perceives the universe primarily in terms of consumable biological resources. The Necrons are old, not old in the way that human civilizations are old, but where a few thousand years of recorded history feels like an eternity. Not old in the way that the Eldari are old, with their tens of thousands of years of continuous cultural memory. The Necrons are old in a way that breaks the scale entirely. Their civilization predates every other currently existing species in the galaxy by such a vast margin that the comparison borders on the meaningless. 60 million years. That is the span of time since the Necrons last walked the galaxy as its undisputed masters. 60 million years since they fought and won the most destructive war the universe has ever known. 60 million years since they retreated into their tomb worlds and entered the long sleep that would carry them across the ages, like passengers on a ship sailing an ocean of time so vast that stars were born and died during the crossing. To understand the Necrons, you have to go back to the beginning. Not their beginning as the undying machine warriors that the galaxy knows today, but their beginning as something else entirely. Something mortal, something fragile, something that lived and breathed and suffered and died. They were called the Necrontyr, and they were, in many ways, a tragic species. Their homeworld orbited a star that bathed them in deadly radiation, ensuring that their lives were short and plagued by disease. While other species in the galaxy enjoyed long lifespans and robust health, the Necrontyr were cursed to wither and die within painfully brief spans of time. This fundamental injustice shaped their entire civilization. Their cities were built not for the living, but for the dead, and vast necropolises and tomb complexes that dwarfed the modest dwellings of the living. Their culture was suffused with death, with the awareness that every moment was borrowed time, that the shadow of extinction hung over every individual and every generation. It was this obsession with death that led them to the stars. The Necrontyr expanded outward from their poisoned homeworld, colonizing distant planets in a desperate bid to escape the radiation that was killing them. They used slow, sublight vessels, clad in a remarkable substance called necrodermis, a living metal that could repair itself and adapt to damage, to cross the void between stars. It was a long and painful process, but the Necrontyr were nothing if not determined. They carved out an empire, established dynasties, built a civilization that spanned significant portions of the galaxy. But they were still dying, still cursed with short lives and fragile bodies, while other species, particularly the ancient and powerful Old Ones, seemed to possess the secrets of immortality. The Old Ones were the first great civilization of the galaxy, beings of immense psychic power who had mastered the warp and created the webway, that labyrinth of extra-dimensional corridors that allowed instantaneous travel across the galaxy. They had seeded the galaxy with life, nurtured countless younger species, and seemed to exist outside the reach of time and death. The Necrontyr begged the Old Ones for the secret of eternal life. The Old Ones refused. That refusal lit the spark that would eventually burn the galaxy. The Necrontyr declared war on the Old Ones, but it was a war they could not win. Despite their technology and their numbers, they were no match for beings who could manipulate the very fabric of reality. The Old Ones used their mastery of the warp and the webway to outmaneuver the Necron Tyre at every turn. Fleets were destroyed, armies routed, and the Necron Tyre found themselves pushed back to the margins of the galaxy, their empire crumbling, their species on the edge of extinction. It was in this moment of absolute desperation that they made the deal that would change everything. Deep in the cosmos, they discovered entities of unimaginable power, energy beings that had existed since the earliest moments of the universe, feeding on the radiation of stars. The Necron Tyre called them the Citan, the star gods. These beings were unfathomably ancient, predating even the old ones. But they had never taken physical form, never interacted directly with the material universe. The Necron Tyre changed that. They forged bodies of necrodermis, of living metal, and gave the C'tan physical shells through which they could interact with reality. The C'tan were grateful, or at least they were willing to make a deal. They offered the Necron Tyre what they had always wanted: immortality, an end to the curse of death that had haunted their species since its birth. The process was called biotransference, and it was, in truth, a horror beyond imagining. The Necron Tyre walked willingly into furnaces of arcane energy, and what came out the other side was something entirely different. Their flesh was gone, replaced by bodies of living metal. Their minds were transferred into these new forms, but something was lost in the translation. But the lower-ranking Necron Tyre lost nearly all of their personality, their emotions, their individuality, reduced to little more than automatons following basic programming. Even the highest-ranking nobility, who received the most sophisticated bodies, found themselves diminished. Emotions dulled, memories faded. The warmth of living flesh was replaced by the cold precision of metal and circuitry. They were immortal now. They would never age, never sicken, never die of natural causes. But they were no longer truly alive. They were the Necrons, armed with the power of the Citan and bodies that could not be permanently destroyed. The Necrons swept back across the galaxy and waged the war in heaven. This was not a conflict on the scale that the younger species would later come to know. This was a war of gods and demigods, a fought across the entire breadth of the galaxy and beyond, a cataclysm that shattered the fundamental framework of reality itself. The energies unleashed during the war in heaven permanently altered the nature of the warp, transforming it from a relatively calm psychic dimension into the roiling, demon-haunted nightmare that it remains today. The Necrons and their C'tan masters fought the Old Ones, and the younger species the Old Ones had created as weapons. The Eldari, the first and greatest of these created species, were psychic warriors of extraordinary power. The Krork, the massive, green-skinned precursors to the modern orcs, were biological engines of war on a scale that modern greenskins can only dimly echo. The Rashan, the Canib, and other now-forgotten species all fought against the Necron advance, as pouring their psychic energies into the conflict in a desperate attempt to halt the mechanical tide. Planets were razed. That phrase appears in many accounts of the war in heaven, and it is worth pausing to consider what it actually means. Not cities destroyed, not continents scarred. Entire worlds, billions of years of geological history and ecological development, reduced to molten slag or cold debris, or simply unmade, removed from the universe as if they had never existed. Suns were extinguished. Stars that had burned for millions of years, that had warmed worlds and sustained life, snuffed out like candles by beings who wielded the fundamental forces of creation as weapons. Black holes were called into being by the reality-warping powers of the star gods, ripping holes in the fabric of space-time that swallowed everything within their reach. The Necrons breached the webway itself, carrying the war into the Old One's most secure refuge, using devices called dolmen gates to tear open portals into that extra-dimensional network and pour their legions through. The Old Ones lost. Overwhelmed by the combined might of the Necrons and the Citan, beset by the psychic horrors they had inadvertently unleashed upon the warp, the Old Ones were destroyed or driven from the galaxy entirely. Their civilization, the oldest and most powerful the galaxy had ever known, was annihilated. But the Necrons' victory was hollow. The Silent King, Zarek, the supreme ruler of the Necron Empire, had watched in growing horror as the Satan devoured the very souls of his people during the biotransference process. The immortality they had been promised had come at the cost of everything that made them who they were. Zarek had bided his time, waiting until the Old Ones were defeated before he made his move. With the war won, he turned the full might of the Necron legions against their Satan masters. The Star Gods were beings of almost limitless power, nearly impossible to destroy entirely, but the Necrons focused the unimaginable energies of the living universe into weapons designed specifically to shatter them. The Satan were broken into fragments, into shards, each one a pale echo of the god it had once been. These shards were imprisoned in tesseract labyrinths, cages of impossible geometry that could contain even the essence of a star god. But the galaxy was in ruins. The war in heaven had devastated everything. But the younger species were rising to fill the power vacuum, and the Necrons, exhausted by the war and the revolt against their masters, could not hold their ground. Zarek made a decision that would echo across 60 million years of history. He ordered the Necrons to retreat to their tomb worlds, to enter a state of hibernation, the Great Sleep, and wait. Wait for the galaxy to heal. Wait for the younger species to exhaust themselves with their petty wars. Wait for the moment when the Necrons could emerge and reclaim what was theirs. Zarek himself did not sleep. He destroyed the command protocols that had allowed him to control the entire Necron race, a penance for the horror he had inflicted upon his people, and went into self-imposed exile in the intergalactic void. For 60 million years, he wandered the emptiness between galaxies, him carrying the weight of his guilt and the fading memories of a species that had once been alive. This is who the Necrons are. This is what sleeps beneath the surface of their tomb worlds. Not a garrison of soldiers or a colony of settlers. A civilization, an entire species, entombed in metal and silence, waiting in the dark. Their warriors are made of living metal that repairs itself, that flows back together after being torn apart, that adapts to damage and reassembles from even the most devastating wounds. Their weapons operate on principles that the younger species can barely comprehend, stripping targets apart at the atomic level, erasing matter from existence with the casual precision of a species that has had 60 million years to perfect the science of destruction. Their tomb worlds are not cities in any conventional sense. They are vast underground complexes, labyrinthine networks of corridors and chambers and stasis crypts stretching deep into the planet's crust, sometimes extending all the way to the core. The architecture is alien in a way that transcends mere unfamiliarity. Human architecture, even at its most experimental, follows certain intuitive principles of space and proportion that derive from the human body and the human experience of gravity and light. Necron architecture follows no such principles. Corridors that seem to curve in directions that three-dimensional space should not allow. Chambers whose dimensions change depending on the angle from which they are observed. Doorways that appear to be solid walls until you approach them at precisely the right angle. The technology that maintains these structures operates on principles that the Adeptus Mechanicus has spent centuries trying to understand and has barely begun to scratch the surface of. Above ground, many tomb worlds appear barren, lifeless, stripped of vegetation and atmosphere, dead worlds orbiting dead stars. Some have been this way since the Necrons first claimed them, deliberately sterilized of all organic life to prevent the enslaver incursions that plagued the galaxy in the aftermath of the war in heaven. Others were once vibrant worlds, rich with life and potential, that have simply degraded over the 60 million years of the Necrons' sleep, their atmospheres leaking away into space, their oceans evaporating, their ecosystems collapsing one by one until nothing remained but dust and stone. And the Necrons did not need atmospheres or ecosystems. They did not need food or water or sunlight. They needed only the cold perfection of their technology and the patience to wait. And wait they did, for 60 million years, while the galaxy above them changed beyond recognition. Species rose and fell. Empires were built and destroyed. The Aeldari created their vast civilization and then destroyed it in a cataclysm of excess that birthed a god of pleasure and tore a hole in reality that became the Eye of Terror. Humanity crawled out of its cradle on old Earth and spread across the stars, building an empire of its own, losing it in the darkness of the Age of Strife, and building it again under the leadership of the Emperor. All of this happened while the Necrons slept, their tomb worlds ticking quietly in the dark. Their systems maintaining the stasis fields that kept their warriors preserved, their sensors monitoring the galaxy above for signs that the time had come to wake. And this is the first, most fundamental reason why the Tyranids avoid these worlds. Because when the hive mind turns its vast alien attention toward a Necron tomb world, when its sensor organisms and psychic awareness reach out to evaluate the planet as a potential target, what it finds is nothing. Or rather, it finds the absence of everything it wants. No biomass, no living organisms to consume, no ecosystems to devour, no atmosphere to filter for organic molecules, no oceans teeming with microscopic life, no forests to strip and dissolve, nothing but rock and metal and silence. And beneath that silence, something that the hive mind recognizes on some deep and primal level as profoundly dangerous. Now, to fully grasp the significance of that moment, when a hive fleet tendril curves away from a Necron world, we need to examine what we know from the official lore. Because this is not speculation or fan theory. This behavior has been documented in the codex entries and campaign narratives that form the backbone of Warhammer 40,000's official history. The most cited and perhaps most significant example comes from the 5th edition Tyranid Codex, and it concerns the world of Solemnnace. Solemnnace is a Necron tomb world, ruled by one of the most eccentric and infamous Necron overlords in the entire galaxy, a figure known as Trazyn the Infinite. Trazyn is a collector, an obsessive hoarder of relics and artifacts from across the galaxy and across time itself. And his galleries contain items of incalculable value and historical significance. Everything from alien weapons to living specimens held in stasis, frozen in time within tesseract labyrinths. It is even rumored that Trazyn possesses a clone of a Primarch somewhere in his vast collection, though which one varies depending on who is telling the story. But for all its treasures, Solemnnace is a typical Necron tomb world in one critical respect. It is essentially devoid of organic life. The world is artificial, a construct of Necron technology designed to house Trazyn's collection and the legions of Necron warriors that serve him. There are no forests, no oceans, no teeming ecosystems. Whatever life might exist on Solemnnace is confined to the specimens in Trazyn's galleries. He's sealed away behind layers of Necron technology that render them invisible to external detection. According to the Codex entry, 2 minor tendrils of Hive Fleet Behemoth, the first great Tyranid hive fleet to invade the galaxy, were on a course that would have brought them into direct contact with Solemnnace. Behemoth, you may recall, was the massive blunt force instrument of the hive mind's first serious incursion into the Milky Way, a fleet of such devastating power that it nearly destroyed the Ultramarines at the Battle of Macragge. Behemoth did not hesitate. Behemoth did not negotiate. Behemoth consumed world after world with the unstoppable momentum of a tidal wave crashing against the shore. Imperial worlds, orc-held worlds, dead worlds with nothing but mineral resources to offer. Behemoth consumed them all. But when those 2 tendrils approached Solemnnace, the hive mind made a different calculation. The tendrils did not attack. They did not even continue on their original course. Instead, they made what the Codex describes as major course corrections, altering their trajectory to avoid conflict with the Necrons of Solemnnace entirely. And when, after these corrections, the tendrils found themselves unable to locate nutrient-rich prey worlds in the immediate vicinity, they did something even more remarkable. they went to sleep. The tendrils lapsed into a state of hibernation, their bioships going dormant, their organisms entering a kind of suspended animation until such time as the hive mind could redirect them toward more profitable targets. Think about what this means. Really let that sink in for a moment. Hive Fleet Behemoth was, as at the time of its arrival, the single most terrifying alien invasion the Imperium had ever faced. It was a juggernaut, a blunt instrument of biological annihilation that smashed through every defense the Imperium put in its path with the relentless momentum of a runaway asteroid. Behemoth consumed the research station on Tyran Primus without breaking stride. It devoured the observation station of Oculus, a moon-sized installation, as casually as a human might eat a handful of berries while walking down a trail. It destroyed the entire Orc freebooter fleet of the Star Crumpus, an armada of kill cruisers that had been a terror to Imperial shipping for decades, in a single naval engagement that left the Greenskin fleet as scattered wreckage drifting through the void. Behemoth did not hesitate when it reached the garden world of Prandium. At the Jewel of Ultramar, a planet of such breathtaking beauty and ecological richness that it was considered one of the wonders of the Imperium. The Ultramarines mounted a desperate defense, throwing their finest warriors against the Tyranid tide, and they were swept aside. Prandium was consumed so thoroughly that even its atmosphere was stripped away, every molecule of oxygen and nitrogen harvested for whatever biomass it contained. This was the fleet that charged headlong at Macragge, the homeworld of the Ultramarines, one of the most heavily fortified planets in the Imperium. This was the fleet that produced the Swarm Lord, the hive mind's deadliest ground commander, a creature of such tactical brilliance and physical power that it nearly killed Marneus Calgar himself, the chapter master of the Ultramarines. As Behemoth was not a subtle fleet, it was not a cautious fleet, it was the hive mind's opening statement to the galaxy, a declaration written in consumed worlds and extinct species that said simply, "We are here and we are hungry." And yet, when two minor tendrils of this most aggressive of hive fleets approached solemnnace, the hive mind chose to alter course rather than engage a Necron world. And when the detour left those tendrils without viable targets, the hive mind chose dormancy over confrontation. It chose to shut down entire tendrils of a hive fleet, tendrils that could have been feeding on biomass-rich worlds elsewhere, rather than risk an engagement with the Necrons. The contrast is staggering. Against the Ultramarines, the greatest Space Marine chapter in the Imperium, Behemoth did not hesitate for a moment. As against the silent tombs of solemnnace, it turned and fled. That alone should tell you everything you need to know about how the hive mind evaluates Necron worlds as targets. Now, some scholars within the lore, and some fans outside it, have debated what exactly this event tells us. There is a school of thought that argues the Tyranids were not specifically avoiding the Necrons, but rather were simply bypassing a world that offered no biomass. By this reading, the hive mind did not recognize solemnnace as a Necron world specifically. It simply detected the absence of organic material and made the economically rational decision to look elsewhere. This is a reasonable interpretation, and it does align with the broader pattern of Tyranid behavior. We know, for instance, that Inquisitor Cryptman deliberately burned several Imperial worlds bare of life in order to create a dead zone that would divert Hive Fleet Leviathan away from more valuable targets. The principle is the same. No biomass, no interest. But there are aspects of the solemnnace incident that suggest something more is going on. The Codex specifically states that the tendrils made course corrections to avoid conflict with the Necrons, not to avoid a barren world, to avoid conflict with a specific faction. The phrasing implies awareness, recognition, an understanding on the part of the hive mind that what lay ahead was not merely empty space, but an active threat, something worth going around rather than through. And this is not the only time this pattern has been observed. Throughout the Codex entries across multiple editions, there are scattered references to Tyranid hive fleets making drastic course changes around seemingly dead worlds. worlds that later turn out to be Necron tomb worlds whose inhabitants had not yet awakened. The consistency of this behavior across different hive fleets and different time periods suggests that it is not coincidental. The hive mind is making a deliberate strategic choice to avoid Necron territory, and it is doing so based on information that goes beyond simple biomass detection. So what does the hive mind know about the Necrons that makes it so cautious? What calculations is it running that consistently produce the same answer? Avoid, redirect, hibernate if necessary, but do not engage. To answer these questions, we need to examine the specific factors that make Necron worlds such unappealing and dangerous targets for Tyranid hive fleets. And the first and most obvious of these factors is the one we have already touched on: the complete and utter absence of anything worth eating. The Tyranid consumption process is one of the most thorough and efficient systems of biological resource extraction in the galaxy. When a hive fleet descends upon a world, the harvesting process does not begin with the first organism that makes planetfall and does not end until the planet has been stripped of every last molecule of usable organic material. The process involves multiple stages, each building on the last, escalating from targeted predation to total planetary dissolution. First come the vanguard organisms, genestealers, lictors, and infiltration infiltration bioforms that have usually been at work on the target world for years or even decades before the main fleet arrives. These organisms gather intelligence, identify defensive weaknesses, and establish footholds that will make the main invasion easier. Genestealer cults, in particular, serve a dual function. They weaken the target world's social structure from within, creating confusion and division among the defenders, while simultaneously acting as psychic beacons that guide the hive fleet toward the planet. Then comes the main invasion force. Mycetic spores rain down from orbit, carrying warriors and monstrous creatures that establish a ground presence and begin the systematic elimination of the planet's defenders. This is the phase most often depicted in the games and the fiction, the dramatic battles between Tyranid swarms and whatever military forces the planet can muster. But for the hive mind, this phase is merely a means to an end. The goal is not conquest in any territorial sense. The goal is to neutralize the planet's ability to resist what comes next. Because what comes next is the real horror. Once the defenders have been eliminated or driven underground, the Tyranids begin the process that xenobiologists call tyrannoforming. Capillary towers, massive biological structures that can stretch hundreds of meters into the sky, sprout from the planet's surface and begin extending tendrils deep into the soil. These tendrils break down organic material at the molecular level, dissolving everything from bedrock bacteria to the root systems of ancient forests into a nutrient-rich slurry that is pumped upward through the capillary towers and eventually into the waiting bioships in orbit. Simultaneously, the atmosphere itself is being harvested. Spore clouds released by the hive fleet filter the air, breaking down airborne microorganisms and organic particles and converting them into usable biomass. Oceans are drained and processed. Soil is stripped of nutrients. Even the planet's crust is mined for useful minerals and elements that can be incorporated into Tyranid biological structures. By the time the hive fleet moves on, the target world is a barren husk, stripped of its atmosphere, its oceans, its soil, its everything. A dead ball of rock spinning in the void. It's as lifeless as a moon and as empty as a spent shell casing. This process requires one thing above all others: biomass, organic material, living things, or things that were once living, that can be broken down into their constituent chemical elements and reassembled into Tyranid organisms. Without biomass, the entire process grinds to a halt. There is nothing to harvest, nothing to process, nothing to feed back into the hive fleet. The invasion becomes a net negative, expending biomass on the creation and deployment of organisms that return nothing. And this is the fundamental problem that Necron worlds present. A Necron tomb world is, From the Tyranid perspective, a nutritional desert. There is no biomass to harvest. The necrons are not organic.
Honestly, this is one of those corners of the lore that I keep coming back to, because most rivalries in 40k are loud. They're bolter fire, war aims, and clashing blades, but this one is quiet. The Tyranids do not roar at the Necrons, and the Necrons do not make speeches about holding the line. There's just silence and avoidance, and somehow that is more unsettling than any battle scene Games Workshop has ever written. It's the lore equivalent of watching two apex predators notice each other and deciding without a word that today is not the day. That restraint from a faction that has none tells you everything. But anyway, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
They are constructs of living metal, of necrodermis, as a material so alien to biological processes that it might as well be antimatter as far as the Tyranid digestive system is concerned. Their buildings are metal. Their technology is metal. Their bodies are metal. Everything about a Necron tomb world screams inedible in whatever biological language the hive mind uses to evaluate potential targets. Now it is true that the Tyranids do not consume biomass exclusively. We know from the lore that they also harvest inorganic materials, minerals, metals, water, atmospheric gases, all of the raw elements that are necessary to build and maintain biological organisms. A living creature, after all, is not made entirely of organic compounds. It needs iron for its blood, calcium for its bones, dozens of trace elements and minerals that can only be acquired from inorganic sources. As the Tyranids are perfectly capable of mining a planet for these resources, and frequently do so as part of the tyranniforming process. But there is a critical distinction between harvesting inorganic resources as a supplement to a biomass-rich invasion and launching a full-scale assault on a world that offers nothing but inorganic material. The energy cost of a Tyranid invasion is enormous. Every organism in the swarm represents an investment of biomass that must be recouped from the target world, or the invasion is a loss. On a biomass-rich world, this investment is easily repaid. The defenders themselves are biomass. The planet's ecosystems are biomass. Even the air and the oceans contain harvestable organic material. The math works out. On a Necron tomb world, the math does not work out. The Tyranids would expend millions, as perhaps billions, of organisms to assault the planet, and in return, they would gain nothing but rock and metal. Whatever minerals might be present on the world's surface could be obtained far more cheaply from uninhabited asteroids or barren moons. There is simply no rational reason for the hive mind to target a Necron world when there are countless biomass-rich alternatives available across the galaxy. But if the absence of biomass were the only factor, the Tyranids would simply ignore Necron worlds the same way they ignore dead asteroids or barren moons. They would not need to make major course corrections. They would not need to go into hibernation. They would just sail past without a second thought. The fact that they do more than simply ignore Necron worlds, the fact that they actively avoid them, it suggests that there are additional factors at play. Factors that make Necron worlds not just unappealing, but actively dangerous to the hive mind and its organisms. And the first of these additional factors has to do with something invisible, something that exists in the spaces between matter and energy, in the dimension that the younger species call the warp, and that the Necrons have spent 60 million years learning how to shut down. The warp is many things to many species. To the Aeldari, it is the medium through which their psychic abilities flow, the source of their power, and ultimately, their damnation. To the forces of chaos, it is home, the seething dimension of emotion and madness from which the dark gods draw their strength. To the Imperium of man, and it is the treacherous ocean through which their ships must travel to cross the vast distances between stars, a necessary evil that must be endured and feared in equal measure. To the Tyranids, the warp is something else entirely, the hive mind, that vast gestalt consciousness that unites and directs every Tyranid organism across the galaxy, is itself a psychic phenomenon. It exists in the warp as much as it exists in the material universe, a presence so enormous and so alien that it casts what xenobiologists call the shadow in the warp, a psychic disturbance so powerful that it drowns out all other psychic activity in its vicinity. Astropaths go mad, psychers scream and convulse, demonic manifestations are suppressed. Even the normal background hum of the warp, in the faint psychic noise generated by the emotions and thoughts of billions of sentient beings, is swallowed up by the all-consuming psychic roar of the hive mind. The synaptic web through which the hive mind controls its organisms is psychic in nature. The synapse creatures, the hive tyrants and warriors and zoanthropes that serve as the hive mind's relay nodes on the battlefield, transmit their commands through psychic impulses that travel through the warp. Without these psychic commands, the lesser tyrannid organisms lose their coordination and revert to basic animal instincts, becoming disorganized, ineffective, and sometimes even self-destructive. The synaptic web is the nervous system of the tyrannid swarm, and it runs on psychic energy. This is the tyrannid's greatest strength and, potentially, their greatest vulnerability, because the necrons possess technology specifically designed to interfere with the warp, not just to resist it or defend against it, but to actively suppress it, to create zones of dead space where psychic phenomena simply cease to function. This technology takes several forms, but the most significant are the null field matrices and the pylon networks that the necrons have deployed on worlds across the galaxy. The null field matrix is a device of almost incomprehensible sophistication, a piece of technology that can project an anti-psychic field large enough to blanket an entire planet. Within the radius of a null field matrix, the warp is damped down, suppressed, effectively muted. Psychic powers fail. Warp travel becomes impossible. Demonic entities lose their connection to the Imperium and dissipate like smoke in the wind. As the pylons are a related but distinct technology, originally deployed during the War in Heaven as weapons against the psychically empowered species created by the Old Ones. Necron pylons are massive structures composed of a substance called noctilith, sometimes known as blackstone, that has the ability to interact with the warp in fundamental ways. When negatively charged, noctilith dampens the warp's influence, creating zones of psychic silence. The most famous examples of this technology were the pylons on Cadia, the fortress world that sat at the mouth of the Eye of Terror. For 10,000 years, those pylons, erected 60 million years ago by the Necrons during the War in Heaven, held back the tide of chaos that seethed within the Eye. When Abaddon the Despoiler finally destroyed Cadia during the 13th Black Crusade, it was the destruction of the pylon network that caused the Great Rift to tear the galaxy in half. Now imagine what this technology means for the tyrannid hive mind. The hive mind's connection to its organisms is psychic. The synaptic web that allows it to coordinate trillions of creatures across thousands of light years is a warp-based phenomenon. When a tyrannid hive fleet enters the sphere of influence of a Necron null field matrix or a pylon network, that psychic connection is disrupted. The synaptic web frays. The commands that flow from the hive mind to its synapse creatures become garbled, weakened, or cut off entirely. The lore tells us that the null field matrix has proven to have a deleterious effect on the Tyranids specifically. The vassals of the hive mind are not immune to the unsettling soullessness of the Necrons, and the null field matrix exacerbates this effect on the normally unbreakable hive mind. The Tyranids find the anti-warp properties of Necron technology disturbing in a way that goes beyond simple tactical inconvenience. There is something about the Necron's null psychic nature that registers to the hive mind as fundamentally wrong, as a void in the psychic landscape that should not exist. Think about what this means from the hive mind's perspective. Here is a species that perceives the galaxy primarily through psychic senses, that navigates and communicates and controls its organisms through warp-based phenomena. And here is a world that is not just psychically silent, but actively psychically hostile. as a dead zone in the warp, that not only offers no psychic information, but actively suppresses the hive mind's ability to process and transmit information. Approaching a Necron tomb world with an active null field matrix must be, for the hive mind, something like a sighted person walking into a room where not only is every light turned off, but the very concept of light has been abolished. It is not just darkness, it is the negation of sight itself. And for a consciousness that relies on psychic perception the way humans rely on vision, that negation is not just inconvenient, it is terrifying. Try to imagine it from the hive mind's perspective, insofar as such a thing is possible for a human mind. You are a consciousness of almost infinite scope spread across light years of space, perceiving the galaxy through billions of sensory inputs simultaneously. You feel every world, every living thing, every pulse of psychic energy across the sector. The galaxy is alive to you in a way that no individual organism can comprehend. You feel the warmth of biomass-rich worlds like bright spots in your awareness, beckoning, inviting, promising sustenance. You feel the psychic signatures of sentient species like flavors on a cosmic tongue, each one unique, each one carrying information about the genetic diversity and nutritional value of the organisms that produce it. And then, as your awareness reaches toward a particular region of space, you feel something else entirely. A gap, a void. Not the natural emptiness of the void between stars, which is simply the absence of input, the way a human might perceive a dark room as merely lacking light. No, this is different. This is an active suppression of your awareness, a force that pushes back against your psychic perception, that muffles and distorts the synaptic signals you rely on, that creates a dead zone in your consciousness where information goes to die. The closer you reach toward it, the stronger the effect becomes. Your synaptic web, normally a robust and redundant network of psychic connections that can reroute around damage and interference, begins to fray at the edges. The organisms you send to investigate lose their connection to you, their reports becoming garbled, intermittent, and then silent. You feel them reverting to instinct, feel the complex tactical protocols you uploaded into their neural pathways dissolving into the simple, inanimal imperatives of feed and flee and fight. And beneath all of this, beneath the static and the silence and the growing dead zone in your awareness, you sense something else, something old, something patient, something that does not broadcast any psychic signature at all, because it does not have one, because it exists entirely in the material universe, soulless and silent, and immune to every form of psychic detection that you possess. You cannot see it, you cannot taste it, you cannot analyze it. You can only sense the negative space it occupies, the hole in your awareness where something should be but is not. And every instinct that 60 million years of galactic predation has bred into your vast, alien consciousness tells you the same thing. Do not go there. There is nothing there for you, only loss. Whilst we know from the lore that when tyrannid organisms lose their connection to the synaptic web, they do not simply stop. They revert to instinctive behavior, which typically means one of two things. They either become mindless predators, attacking anything that moves, including other tyrannids, or they become disoriented and passive, milling about aimlessly until the synaptic connection is restored. Neither of these outcomes is useful for the hive mind. An army of tyrannids that has lost its coordination is not an invasion force. It is a collection of animals, dangerous animals to be sure, but animals nonetheless, incapable of the complex tactical operations necessary to overcome the defenders of a Necron tomb world. And the defenders of a Necron tomb world are not to be underestimated. The solemnnace incident also carries an additional layer of significance that some lore scholars have highlighted. Solemnnace specifically is known to possess an anti-warp system similar to the Cadian pylons. This means that the two tendrils of Behemoth were not just approaching a barren world, they were approaching a world that was actively broadcasting a psychic null field into the surrounding space. It is entirely possible that the hive mind did not simply detect the absence of biomass on solemnnace, but actively felt the disruption of its psychic awareness as it drew closer, a growing dead spot in its perception that registered as a warning sign. The implications of this are profound. If the hive mind can detect Necron anti-warp technology at a distance, if it can sense the presence of a null field from light years away, and adjust its course accordingly, then its avoidance of Necron worlds is not merely an economic decision about biomass. It is a survival instinct. The hive mind is protecting its most vital asset, its synaptic web, its ability to function as a coordinated intelligence, by steering clear of the one thing in the galaxy specifically designed to shut that ability down. This also helps explain why the Tyranids do not simply scout Necron worlds from a distance, evaluate them, and move on. The act of scouting requires extending the synaptic web into the area around the target world. If that area is saturated with anti-psychic energy, the scouting process itself becomes dangerous. Vanguard organisms sent to evaluate the world might lose their connection to the hive mind and become useless. The psychic probes that the hive mind uses to assess potential targets might be reflected or absorbed. The very act of reaching toward a Necron world might cause the hive mind to experience something analogous to pain, and so the hive fleet turns away. Not out of fear exactly. The hive mind is too alien for such a human emotion, but out of something that serves the same function. A recognition that what lies ahead is not prey, but a predator of a kind the hive mind cannot easily overcome. A dead zone in the cosmic feast that offers nothing but danger and loss. But the psychic interference is only part of the equation. Even if the hive mind could somehow overcome the null fields and maintain its synaptic web in the vicinity of a Necron tomb world, the organisms it sent to fight there would face a military challenge unlike anything they encounter elsewhere in the galaxy. Because the Necrons do not fight like other species, their weapons do not simply kill, they unmake. The standard armament of a Necron warrior, the most basic and numerous soldier in the Necron legions, is a Gauss Flayer. To say that a Gauss Flayer kills its target is a profound understatement. A Gauss Flayer does not simply punch a hole through armor or shred flesh with kinetic force. It strips the target apart at the atomic level, using an energy field that breaks the bonds between atoms and disassembles matter itself, layer by layer, molecule by molecule, when the target is reduced to its constituent components and effectively ceases to exist. This is the weapon carried by the lowest-ranking, most expendable soldier in the Necron military. Every single warrior in a Necron legion carries a weapon that can dissolve ceramite armor, living flesh, and just about any other form of matter with equal ease. The effect on organic targets is particularly horrifying. Flesh simply comes apart, dissolving in a cascade of molecular disintegration that leaves nothing behind for the Tyranids to reclaim. And this is where the economic calculation of a Tyranid invasion goes from unfavorable to catastrophic. Remember, the Tyranid invasion model is based on a simple principle. Biomass invested must be less than biomass recovered. When a Gaunt is killed by a bolter round on a normal battlefield, the Gaunt's body is still there. It is still biomass. The Ripper swarms can consume it, and the digestion pools can process it, and the fleet can reclaim the investment. The same is true for any conventional weapon: lasergun, melter, plasma, chainsword, power fist. These weapons kill, but they do not annihilate. The biomass remains. Gauss weapons are different. When a Gauss Flayer disintegrates a Tyranid organism, there is nothing left to reclaim. The biomass is not killed, it is erased. Every Gaunt, every warrior, every monstrous creature that falls to Necron Gauss fire represents a permanent net loss for the hive fleet. The invested biomass is gone, scattered into its component atoms, dispersed beyond any possibility of recovery. Now multiply this across an entire planetary assault. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of Tyranid organisms making landfall on a Necron tomb world, advancing through fields of Gauss fire that dissolves them row by row. Each fallen organism is a loss that cannot be recouped. Each wave of attackers that breaks against the Necron defenses represents biomass that the hive fleet will never see again. And the Necrons, unlike organic defenders, do not themselves provide any biomass when destroyed. You cannot eat metal, you cannot digest necrodermis, you cannot break down and reprocess the inorganic components of a Necron warrior into Tyranid biological material. Imagine a Carnifex, one of the Tyranids' most powerful ground assault organisms, charging into a line of Necron immortals. The Carnifex is a biological masterpiece, a creature engineered by the hive mind to be a living battering ram, capable of tearing through fortifications and crushing armored vehicles with its massive claws. Against most enemies, the Carnifex is devastating. Its thick chitin armor can absorb tremendous punishment, and its close combat weapons can slice through ceramite and plasteel like paper. But against the immortals, with their Gauss blasters, the Carnifex faces a different kind of threat. Each Gauss beam that strikes its body does not merely wound it. Each beam strips away layers of organic material, dissolving chitin and muscle and organ tissue at the molecular level. The Carnifex might still close the distance, might still tear apart a few immortals with its claws, but those immortals will reassemble themselves within minutes, their living metal bodies flowing back together, their weapons recharging, their targeting systems coming back online. And the Carnifex, wounded and bleeding, its body riddled with gaps where Gauss fire has eaten away its flesh, has nothing to show for its effort. The metal shards of the Necrons it destroyed are indigestible. The biomass it lost to Gauss fire is irrecoverable. This scenario, multiplied across every unit and every engagement in a planetary campaign, creates a death spiral for the Tyranid force. Each hour of combat sees the Hive Fleet's biomass reserves diminish, while the Necron garrison remains at or near full strength. The living metal flows. The reanimation protocols activate. The warriors stand back up. And the Tyranids have a little less of themselves to work with. So the equation is devastatingly simple. The Tyranids invest biomass, the Necrons destroy it permanently. And the Necrons themselves offer nothing in return. Every exchange is a loss. Every engagement drains the Hive Fleet without replenishing it. The longer the battle goes on, the weaker the Tyranids become, and the stronger, relatively speaking, the Necrons remain. But it gets worse, because Gauss flayers are merely the starting point of the Necron arsenal. They are the standard issue weapon, the equivalent of a laser gun in Imperial terms, the most common and least exotic of all Necron armaments. The higher up the Necron military hierarchy you go, the more devastating and the more incomprehensible the weapons become. Tesla weapons represent a lateral step from Gauss technology. Where Gauss weapons strip matter apart at the atomic level, Tesla weapons unleash arcs of living lightning that leap from target to target, growing more powerful with each jump. Against Tyranid swarm organisms, this is particularly effective. A single Tesla bolt hitting a cluster of gaunts does not stop at the first target. It arcs to the next, and the next, and the next, each discharge feeding off the energy released by the previous kill. In the densely packed formations that Tyranid swarms favor, a Tesla weapon can kill dozens of organisms with a single trigger pull. Then there are the particle weapons. These fire-concentrated beams of antimatter and the physics of antimatter annihilation are something that no biological defense can counter. When matter meets antimatter, both are converted entirely into energy in a reaction of perfect efficiency. It does not matter how thick the chitin armor is, how dense the bio-armor plating, how cleverly the hive mind has engineered its organism's defenses. Antimatter does not care about biological countermeasures. It annihilates everything it touches with the implacable certainty of fundamental physics. And then there are the truly exotic weapons, the ones that make even hardened Imperial commanders go quiet when they appear in intelligence briefings. The Doomsday Cannon, mounted on the aptly named Doomsday Ark, fires a beam of concentrated energy powerful enough to vaporize a battle tank in a single shot. The weapons mounted on Necron monoliths can teleport organisms directly into the combat zone, while simultaneously projecting a night shroud field that interferes with enemy targeting. The Citan shards, imprisoned gods of unimaginable power, as can be unleashed on the battlefield to wield reality-warping abilities that defy conventional description. One shard might transmute the very ground beneath a Tyranid army into quicksand. Another might reverse the flow of time in a localized area, undoing the damage that the Tyranids have inflicted. A third might simply reach out and extinguish every organic process within a given radius, killing everything alive without any visible mechanism of destruction. And presiding over all of this is perhaps the most terrifying weapon in the Necron arsenal, one that is not a weapon at all in the conventional sense: the World Engine. In 926 of the 41st Millennium, a Necron device of staggering scale appeared in the Vidar subsector. It was a planet-sized construct, a mobile fortress bristling with weapons that could scour entire worlds of life from orbit. Its void shields were impervious to every weapon the Imperium could bring to bear. Drop pods, boarding torpedoes, teleportation beams, all of these were reflected or scrambled by the World Engine's defenses. It took the sacrifice of an entire Space Marine chapter, the Astral Knights, who rammed their battle barge into the World Engine's hull and fought their way into its interior to finally bring it down. 772 Space Marines entered the World Engine. Not one survived. This is what the Tyranids would be facing if they attacked a major Necron tomb world in force. Not just warriors with advanced rifles, but a civilization that builds planet-sized war machines, that employs imprisoned gods as battlefield weapons, and that can manipulate time and matter and the fundamental forces of the universe with a casual expertise born of 60 million years of technological refinement. The Tyranids are the ultimate predator, but the Necrons are something worse. They are the ultimate counter-predator, a species that has evolved, or rather engineered itself, beyond the reach of predation entirely. The Necrons possess a range of weaponry that reads like a catalogue of the universe's most exotic and devastating methods of destruction. Tesla weapons that unleash arcs of living lightning, jumping from target to target with increasing ferocity. Particle weapons that fire concentrated beams of antimatter. Doomsday weapons capable of unleashing energy sufficient to crack a planet's crust. And more esoteric armaments that defy conventional understanding entirely. It's weapons that phase targets out of reality, that trap them in pocket dimensions, that erase them from the timeline. Consider the implications for Tyranid adaptation. The Tyranids' greatest strength, beyond their sheer numbers, is their ability to adapt. The hive mind analyzes every threat it encounters and engineers new bioforms specifically designed to counter that threat. When a hive fleet encounters a species that relies heavily on armor, the hive mind develops organisms with acid that can dissolve that armor. When it encounters a species that uses psychic warfare, it develops creatures with stronger psychic defenses or creates the specialized anti-psychic adaptations seen in Hive Fleet Kronos. But how do you adapt to Gauss weapons? How do you develop a biological defense against a weapon that disassembles matter at the atomic level? The fundamental forces that Gauss weapons exploit are not biological phenomena, they are physics. And you cannot evolve a defense against physics. You cannot grow a shell that prevents your atoms from being torn apart, because the shell itself is made of atoms that are equally vulnerable to the same process. The same applies to many other Necron weapons. How do you adapt to antimatter? There is no biological defense against the annihilation reaction between matter and antimatter. How do you adapt to being phased out of reality? There is no evolutionary counter to being removed from the space-time continuum. How do you adapt to weapons that manipulate time itself, that erase events from history, that trap organisms in temporal loops? The Tyranids are the ultimate biological adapters. They can overcome almost any threat given enough time and enough biomass to experiment with. But Necron technology is not biological. It operates on principles that are fundamentally alien to biological processes, principles that the Tyranids cannot counter through evolution, because evolution operates within the framework of biology, not outside it. The Necrons fight with the fundamental forces of the universe itself, forces that biology cannot override any more than a fish can adapt to survive in a vacuum. And then there are the Necrons' own defensive capabilities to consider. Every Necron warrior, from the lowliest foot soldier to the most powerful overlord, possesses reanimation protocols. When a Necron is damaged or destroyed on the battlefield, its body does not simply lie there. The living metal begins to repair itself, flowing back together, reknitting torn components, reassembling shattered limbs. If the damage is too severe for field repair, the Necron phases out entirely, teleporting back to the nearest tomb complex, where it can be fully repaired and returned to service. This means that the Necrons do not suffer permanent casualties in the same way that other species do. A Necron warrior that is torn apart by a Tyranid bioweapon today can be reassembled and standing in formation again tomorrow. The Necrons' losses are temporary. The Tyranids' losses against Gauss weapons are permanent. Over the course of a sustained campaign, this asymmetry becomes overwhelming. The Necrons keep getting back up. The Tyranids keep disappearing. The hive mind, with its cold and alien capacity for calculation, understands this, as it does not need to fight a campaign against the Necrons to understand the math. It can run the numbers based on what its vanguard organisms have observed, based on the genetic memories accumulated over millions of years of consuming species across multiple galaxies, based on whatever ancient knowledge the hive mind carries within its vast psychic consciousness. The numbers do not work. The equation does not balance. A war against the Necrons is a war of attrition that the Tyranids will lose, not through any single decisive defeat, but through the slow and inexorable bleeding away of irreplaceable biomass against an enemy that loses nothing. And so the hive fleet turns. The tendrils bend away. The hunger finds other prey. There is another dimension to this story, one that takes us beyond the immediate tactical considerations and into the grand strategic currents that shape the entire galaxy. Because the relationship between the Tyranids and the Necrons is not merely one of avoidance. It is one of existential opposition, a cosmic rivalry that has been recognized and acted upon by one of the most powerful individuals in the galaxy, the last silent king of the Necron Empire, Sarek. We spoke earlier of Sarek's self-imposed exile, his journey into the intergalactic void as penance for the horror of biotransference. For 60 million years, the Silent King wandered the emptiness between galaxies, carrying the burden of his guilt and searching for something, though the lore is deliberately vague about exactly what he was looking for. Some scholars speculate that he was searching for a way to reverse biotransference, to restore his people to their original organic bodies. Others suggest that he was surveying the intergalactic void for threats or opportunities that the sleeping Necron Empire might need to address upon waking. What he found was the Tyranids. Somewhere in the vast darkness between galaxies, in the cold and empty reaches, where even starlight is a distant memory, the Silent King encountered the approaching Tyranid hive fleets. Not the relatively small tendrils that had already reached the Milky Way's eastern fringe, but the main body of the Tyranid migration. The true scale of the Great Devourer, the inconceivable mass of bioships and organisms that was still making its way toward the galaxy from whatever distant origin the Tyranids had departed. The lore is deliberately sparse on the details of this encounter, and that sparseness is itself significant. We do not know exactly when Sarek encountered the Tyranids. We do not know the circumstances of the meeting, whether it was a chance encounter in the intergalactic void, a deliberate investigation of some anomaly detected at extreme range, or something else entirely. There are even scholars who question the official narrative, pointing out that the intergalactic void is so incomprehensibly vast that a chance encounter between two entities, even entities of galactic scale, strains credulity. Something must have drawn the Silent King's attention to the Tyranids, or drawn the Tyranids' attention to him, and the lore does not explain what that something was. What we do know is that the scale of what Zarek saw must have been staggering even for a being who had witnessed the war in heaven and the destruction of entire star systems. Here was a biological phenomenon so vast that it dwarfed anything the galaxy had ever produced, a tide of living matter stretching across the intergalactic void like a continent of hunger moving through the dark. Bioships the size of moons, surrounded by clouds of smaller organisms that served as escorts, scouts, and foragers. Digestion pools large enough to swallow asteroids, tentacles of organic matter reaching across light years, probing the void ahead of the main fleet, searching for the faintest traces of biomass that might indicate a galaxy worth consuming. Zarek recognized the threat immediately, as not just the physical threat of the Tyranids' military power, though that was considerable, but the existential threat they posed to his deepest ambitions for his people. The Silent King's ultimate goal was to reverse biotransference, to find organic bodies that could serve as vessels for Necron consciousness, to give his people back the flesh and blood that had been taken from them 60 million years ago. For this plan to work, the galaxy needed to contain organic life. It needed to have species capable of producing the biological infrastructure that the Necrons could someday inhabit. If the Tyranids consumed all organic life in the galaxy, that dream would die forever. There would be no species left to serve as vessels. There would be no biological material left to work with. The Necrons would be trapped in their metal bodies for eternity, denied any hope of redemption or restoration. The Tyranids were not just a military threat. They were a threat to the very possibility of a future for the Necron race. And so, in 744 of the 41st Millennium, the Silent King broke his exile and returned to the galaxy. He came back not as a conqueror or a ruler, but as a warner, a prophet of doom carrying the message that the Tyranids were coming and that the Necrons must prepare. He began a long and secretive campaign to awaken the sleeping tomb worlds, to unite the fractured Necron dynasties, and to marshal the forces that would be needed to confront the Great Devourer. This was not an easy task. The Necron dynasties had been sleeping for 60 million years, and many of them had suffered catastrophic damage during the intervening eons. Tomb worlds had been destroyed by cosmic disasters or invaded by alien species that had no idea what lay beneath the surface. Others had suffered from the simple entropy of time, their systems degrading, their inhabitants' minds eroding, their technology failing in subtle and devastating ways. Many of the Necrons who awoke were damaged, confused, or outright insane, their memories corrupted by the long sleep, their personalities distorted beyond recognition. And there were political complications as well. The Necron dynasties had never been a unified polity in the way that the Imperium of man at least aspires to be. They were a feudal collection of competing noble houses, each ruled by its own Pharaon, each pursuing its own agenda, and each jealous of its own power and suspicious of its neighbors. Zarek had destroyed the command protocols that would have allowed him to compel obedience. He could persuade, he could cajole, he could threaten, but he could not simply order the dynasties to follow him. Despite these obstacles, Zarek made progress. He traveled from tomb world to tomb world, awakening dynasties and warning them of the Tyranid threat. He worked through intermediaries, through the Triarch Praetorians who still recognized his authority, through cryptecs and overlords who could be convinced that the Tyranid menace was real and imminent. Slowly, painfully, the Necron race began to stir. One of the most dramatic demonstrations of Zarek's commitment to fighting the Tyranids came during the Gehenna campaign in 955 of the 41st Millennium. And on the world of Gehenna, a Necron force under the command of the Silent King himself encountered a Blood Angels Space Marine detachment. Under normal circumstances, the Necrons and the Blood Angels would have been enemies, two factions with no reason to cooperate and every reason to fight. But when Tyranid organisms appeared over Gehenna, threatening to overwhelm both forces, the Silent King made a decision that stunned Imperial observers. He allied with the Blood Angels. Necron and Space Marine fought side by side against the Tyranid swarm, combining their firepower and their tactical abilities to drive back the Great Devourer. When the battle was won, the Silent King allowed the Blood Angels to depart unharmed. It was an act of pragmatic generosity that revealed much about Sarek's priorities. The Tyranids were the primary enemy. Everything else, the Imperium, the Eldari, the Orcs, even the forces of chaos, all of these were secondary concerns that could be dealt with later. The Tyranids had to be stopped first, or nothing else would matter. The lore even hints at a deeper historical connection between the Silent King and humanity's champions. There are cryptic references to Zarek having met Sanguinius, the Primarch of the Blood Angels, at some point during the Great Crusade, 10,000 years before the current setting of the game. The exact nature of this meeting is unclear, but the Silent King is recorded as having expressed admiration for Sanguinius and regretted his death. He reportedly mused that if Sanguinius had survived and become emperor instead of the being currently sitting on the Golden Throne, an alliance between Necrons and humans might have been possible, and the Tyranid threat might have been contained before it ever reached the galaxy. These are tantalizing hints at a deeper narrative, a story of missed opportunities and roads not taken that adds layers of tragedy to the already bleak relationship between the two species and their shared enemy. But the practical upshot is clear. The Silent King considers the Tyranids to be the single greatest threat facing the Necron race, and he has dedicated his considerable resources and political influence to ensuring that his people are prepared to fight them. This brings us to the most ambitious and most terrifying of the Necron's anti-Tyranid preparations. A project so vast in scope and so devastating in its potential implications that it threatens to reshape the galaxy itself. Get the pariah nexus. The pariah nexus is, in the simplest possible terms, the logical extension of the Necron's anti-warp technology scaled up to a galactic level. If a single null field matrix can blanket a planet in psychic silence, and a network of pylons can hold back the Eye of Terror, then what happens when you deploy pylons across an entire sector of space? What happens when you create not just a planet-sized dead zone, but a region-sized dead zone, a volume of space so thoroughly saturated with anti-psychic energy that the warp itself is effectively banished from it? That is the pariah nexus. Officially known to the Necrons as the contra-empiric nexus, it is located in the Nephilim sector within Ultima Segmentum. It is a vast network of Blackstone pylons deployed across dozens of star systems. As each pylon, a colossal structure extending 0.5 kilometer above the surface and 1/4 kilometer below, each one broadcasting anti-psychic energy in patterns of such complexity that they are described as non-Euclidean fractal crypto logic, mathematics so advanced that no mortal mind can comprehend them. The sheer scale of the engineering involved beggars description. Each pylon is a unique colossal structure, not mass-produced, but individually designed to sustain and extend a field of anti-empiric energy that interlocks with the fields of every other pylon in the network. The arrangement of these pylons follows patterns that human mathematicians have described as impossible, geometries that should not work in three-dimensional space, but that somehow function in whatever higher dimensional framework the Necron architects were working within. The cryptech Illuminor Ceres and the Nihilach dynasty are credited with the construction of this monumental project, though the influence and direction of the Silent King himself is unmistakable. At the heart of the Nexus is the Zendu system, where an immense Blackstone cage has been constructed, surrounded by vast fleets of Necron warships and orbital installations. This is the command center of the project, the point from which the entire network is coordinated and from which its effects radiate outward across the sector. The concentration of Necron military power around Zendu is staggering. Dozens of warships, yet including the massive Cairn-class tomb ships that are among the most powerful vessels in the galaxy, patrol the approaches to the system. Orbital installations bristle with weapons that could reduce entire fleets to debris. And on the surfaces of the planets within the system, legions of Necron warriors stand ready to defend the great work against any threat. Within the pariah nexus, the effects on the warp are devastating. Warp travel becomes vastly more difficult, if not impossible. Astropathic communication, the psychic messaging system that is the backbone of imperial governance and military coordination, is suppressed. Psykers find their powers diminished or eliminated entirely. Demonic manifestations become impossible. And living beings who spend time within the Nexus experience what has been dubbed the stilling, as a numbing despair that worsens over time, draining the will to live, the capacity for emotion, the very spark of consciousness that separates a sentient being from an automaton. For the Imperium and any other psychic-reliant species, the pariah nexus is a nightmare. But consider what it means for the Tyranids. The hive mind is a psychic entity. Its synaptic web is psychic. Its ability to coordinate and direct its organisms depends entirely on warp-based phenomena. Within the pariah nexus, the hive mind's connection to its swarms would be severed or degraded to the point of uselessness. Tyrannid organisms that entered the nexus would lose their coordination, reverting to instinctive behavior, becoming scattered and disorganized. And the complex tactical operations that allow the Tyranids to overwhelm even the most formidable defenders would become impossible. The swarm would become a mob. If the pariah nexus were ever completed, if its pylon networks were ever extended to the point where their fields merged and covered a significant portion of the galaxy, the Tyranid threat would be neutralized. Not through military force, not through attrition, but through the simple expedient of cutting the puppet strings. The hive mind would still exist, out there in the void, raging and hungry. But its organisms within the nexus would be mindless animals, easily hunted down and destroyed by Necron legions that are entirely unaffected by the suppression of the warp. This is the Silent King's grand strategy. This is the endgame toward which 60 million years of Necron history has been building. Not a war of extermination against the Tyranids, because the Necrons likely lack the numbers to win such a war through force alone, but a war of denial. A war to reshape the galaxy itself into an environment that is fundamentally hostile to the hive mind's mode of existence. A war to make the galaxy inedible, impenetrable, and incomprehensible to the Great Devourer. It is, in many ways, the mirror image of the Tyranids' own strategy. The Tyranids reshape worlds to suit their needs, stripping them of life and converting them into biomass. The Necrons are reshaping the galaxy to suit theirs, stripping it of psychic energy and converting it into a dead zone where only they can function. Two forces, each trying to remake the galaxy in its own image. On one biological, one mechanical, one that consumes everything, one that denies everything. The irony is almost beautiful in its symmetry, but the pariah nexus is not yet complete. The project has been beset by challenges from multiple directions. The Imperium, alarmed by the psychic dead zone expanding in the Nephilim sector, has sent battle groups to investigate and oppose the Necron construction efforts. Imhotep the Stormlord, one of the most powerful Necron overlords and a political rival to the Silent King, has actively sabotaged the project, destroying several pylons in what amounts to a Necron civil war. Even the forces of chaos have taken an interest, with Vashtor and his legions arriving in the area, drawn by the prospect of Noctilith that could be subverted to their own purposes. As the pariah nexus stands as a testament to both the genius and the hubris of the Necrons. It is the ultimate anti-Tyranid weapon, a cosmic-scale solution to a cosmic-scale problem. But whether it will ever be completed, and what it will cost the galaxy if it is, remains an open question. For now, it serves as a reminder that the Necrons are not merely reacting to the Tyranid threat. They are planning against it with the patience and precision that only a 60-million-year-old civilization can bring to bear. While the general pattern is one of avoidance, the Tyranids and Necrons have not entirely escaped each other's notice. There are documented instances in the lore where the two species have come into direct conflict. And these engagements provide valuable insight into what happens when the unstoppable appetite meets the immovable machine. We have already discussed the Gehenna campaign, where the Silent King allied with the Blood Angels to fight Tyranid forces. This is perhaps the most famous example of Necron-Tyranid conflict in the lore. And it is notable not just for the battle itself, but for what it reveals about the Silent King's priorities and his willingness to cooperate with other species against the common Tyranid threat. But there are other examples, scattered through the Codex entries and campaign supplements, that paint a broader picture of what happens when these two forces collide. In some recorded instances, Tyranid swarms have inadvertently landed on worlds where Necrons had established a presence, either because the Necrons had not yet fully awakened and their tomb world was not broadcasting the psychic null fields that normally warn the hive mind away, or because the Tyranid fleet was moving too quickly to adjust course. In these cases, the results have been consistently devastating for the Tyranids. Necron warriors have marched through Tyranid acid storms unscathed, their living metal bodies shrugging off biological weapons designed to dissolve ceramite and plasteel. Gauss flayers have torn through Tyranid bioforms with mechanical precision, leaving nothing behind for the swarm to reclaim. And the Necrons' reanimation protocols have ensured that their losses are temporary, while every Tyranid organism destroyed by Gauss fire is a permanent subtraction from the fleet's biomass reserves. One particularly telling detail from the lore concerns the hive mind's documented response to these engagements. When Tyranid swarms encounter Necrons and discover that their enemy offers no biomass reward for the effort of killing them, the hive mind often chooses to break off the engagement rather than commit additional resources. This is unusual behavior for the Tyranids. Against most enemies, the hive mind will escalate, sending larger and more powerful organisms to overcome resistance, adapting its tactics in real time to counter the enemy's defenses. Against the Necrons, the hive mind appears to have learned or always known that escalation is futile. More organisms means more biomass lost, not more biomass gained. Yet this tendency to disengage rather than escalate has led some Imperial scholars to conclude that the hive mind has essentially classified the Necrons as a low-priority target, not because they are weak, but because they are fundamentally unrewarding. The hive mind conserves its resources for targets that offer a positive return on investment, and the Necrons, quite simply, do not. But there is an important caveat to this analysis. The Tyranid avoidance of Necron worlds is not absolute. When a Necron tomb world sits directly in the path of a major hive fleet advance, and there is no convenient way around it, or when the hive mind determines that removing a Necron garrison is necessary to secure access to biomass-rich worlds beyond, the Tyranids will fight. They do not like it, if the hive mind can be said to like or dislike anything. The cost-benefit analysis comes back negative, but the hive mind is capable of accepting short-term losses for long-term strategic gains, and if eliminating a Necron presence opens up a corridor to rich hunting grounds, the expenditure may be deemed acceptable. It is also worth noting that not all Necron tomb worlds are equal. Some are vast, fully awakened fortresses, bristling with weapons and defended by millions of warriors. Others are damaged, degraded, only partially awakened, with skeleton garrisons and malfunctioning defenses. A hive fleet that might avoid a fully operational tomb world like solemnnace might not hesitate to attack a damaged and weakened tomb world if the strategic situation demanded it. The relationship between the Tyranids and the Necrons is not a simple binary of always avoids or always fights. It is a complex, situational calculation that the hive mind makes on a case-by-case basis, weighing the specific variables of each encounter against its overall strategic objectives. What remains consistent is the general pattern. The hive mind views the Necrons as high-cost, low-reward targets and prefers to direct its resources elsewhere whenever possible. There are also the more exotic engagements to consider. Some lore passages mention Necron cryptechs who have experimented with Tyranid bioforms, studying them with the same clinical detachment that a human scientist might bring to dissecting a particularly interesting insect. The cryptech Illuminor Ceras, one of the most brilliant and morally questionable minds in the Necron Empire, is known to have conducted extensive research on Tyranid organisms, presumably looking for weaknesses that the Necrons can exploit. On the other side, there is speculation that the hive mind has attempted to adapt to the specific challenges posed by the necrons. Some tyrannid bioforms have been observed producing acidic compounds potent enough to corrode necrodermis, though the self-repairing nature of living metal makes this a losing proposition in most cases. Others have developed electromagnetic, pulse-like biological abilities that can temporarily disrupt necron systems, though the redundancy and resilience of necron technology means that these disruptions are rarely more than momentary inconveniences. The Tyranids evolve. They adapt. They are perhaps the single most adaptable species in the galaxy's history. But against the necrons, they face an enemy that was literally designed by the C'tan themselves to be immune to the fundamental forces that the Tyranids rely on. The C'tan created the necrons specifically to counter psychic species. The necrons' anti-warp technology was developed during the War in Heaven specifically to defeat enemies who relied on the warp for their power. The Tyranids, with their warp-based hive mind and psychic synaptic web, are exactly the kind of enemy that the necrons were built to fight. It is one of the great ironies of the Warhammer 40,000 setting. The necrons did not know the Tyranids existed when they developed their anti-warp technology 60 million years ago. They were building weapons against the old ones and their psychically empowered creations. But those weapons, designed for a war that ended before humanity's ancestors had evolved, are almost perfectly suited to counter the greatest biological threat the galaxy has ever faced. The universe, it seems, has a dark sense of humor. There is one final thread to pull in this story, one that weaves through everything we have discussed and ties it together into a narrative that is as tragic as it is grand. And it concerns the deepest irony at the heart of the Necron-Tyranid relationship. The fact that both species are, in their own way, trapped by the same fundamental problem, the relationship between the organic and the mechanical. The Necrons were once organic. The Necron Tyre, with their short, radiation-scarred lives and their desperate envy of the immortal Old Ones, were flesh and blood creatures who lived and loved and feared and died. They gave up that flesh willingly, or at least under the belief that they were making a rational choice in exchange for immortality. What they received was existence without life, consciousness without sensation, eternity without meaning. The Silent King's deepest ambition is to undo this trade, to find a way to restore his people to organic bodies, to give them back the capacity for experience that was stripped away during biotransference. The Tyranids, by contrast, are entirely organic. They are biology pushed to its absolute extreme, life evolved and engineered to the point where it has become a cosmic force, a tide of organic matter sweeping across the galaxy with the implacable inevitability of entropy itself. Everything about the Tyranids is biological. Their weapons are biological. Their ships are biological. Their intelligence, the hive mind itself, is a biological phenomenon, a psychic gestalt generated by the combined neural activity of trillions of organic brains. And here is the irony. The Necrons, who desperately want to be organic again, are immune to the one force in the galaxy that exists solely to consume organic matter. And the Tyranids, who exist solely to consume organic matter, are powerless against the one species in the galaxy that has transcended biology entirely. The Necrons cannot be eaten because they gave up everything edible 60 million years ago. The Tyranids cannot eat the Necrons because the Necrons have already done to themselves what the Tyranids do to everyone else. They have been consumed, not by a biological predator, but by their own technology. The biotransference process devoured their souls, their personalities, their organic essence, and left behind only metal and memory. The C'tan ate the Necron Tyre and spat out the Necrons, and now the Tyranids look at what remains and find nothing worth consuming. It is almost poetic in its cruelty. The Necrons escaped the Tyranids' hunger by undergoing a process that was itself a form of consumption. They were devoured by the C'tan before the Tyranids could devour them. And now they exist in a state that is, For the hive mind, the biological equivalent of ashes, already consumed, already processed, already emptied of everything nutritious. This adds a layer of existential weight to the Silent King's crusade against the Tyranids. Sarek is not just fighting to protect his people from military destruction. He is fighting to protect the possibility of redemption, the hope that someday, somehow, the curse of biotransference can be reversed and the necrons can reclaim the organic existence that was taken from them. If the Tyranids consume all organic life, that hope dies. Not because the Tyranids will harm the necrons directly, but because they will destroy the raw materials, the organic species, the biological infrastructure that the necrons need to rebuild themselves. The Silent King is fighting to save flesh. Not his own flesh, which was lost 60 million years ago, but the flesh of strangers, of species he does not know and in many cases does not care about, because those strangers and their flesh represent the only chance his people will ever have to feel again, to taste, to touch, to know what it is like to have a heartbeat and warm blood and the gentle pressure of another's hand. It is, when you stop to think about it, one of the most quietly heartbreaking motivations in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. The immortal Machine King, wandering the galaxy for 60 million years, haunted by the memory of what it felt like to be alive, fighting to preserve a galaxy full of organic life that he will never be able to touch or taste or feel. All so that someday his people might have the chance to be mortal again. And standing between him and that dream is the hive mind, a consciousness so vast and so alien that it cannot comprehend what it threatens. The hive mind does not understand mortality or mortality's value. It does not understand the longing for organic sensation that drives the Silent King. It understands only consumption, only hunger, only the relentless imperative to devour and grow and spread. Two incomprehensible intelligences, each ancient beyond measure, each operating on a scale that defies human comprehension, locked in a rivalry that neither fully understands and neither can easily win. The hive mind cannot eat the necrons. The necrons cannot exterminate the Tyranids, and so they circle each other across the galaxy, the hunger and the machine, each aware of the other's presence, each adjusting its strategies in response to the other's movements, each waiting for the moment when the balance might shift. Some scholars of the Ordo Xenos have attempted to model what would happen if the Tyranids and Necrons were the last two forces standing in the galaxy, if every other species and faction were removed from the equation and only these two remained. The results of these thought experiments are uniformly bleak. Without organic species to consume, the Tyranid hive fleets would eventually starve, their biomass reserves depleted by the energy costs of maintaining their bioships and organisms in the void between stars. But this process would take millennia, perhaps tens of millennia, and during that time the hive fleets would become increasingly desperate and increasingly aggressive, willing to attack even the most unfavorable targets in search of sustenance. The Necrons, for their part, would survive. They do not need food. They do not need air. They do not need anything that the Tyranids could deny them. But they would survive in a galaxy stripped of all organic life, a galaxy of dead worlds and empty oceans and atmospheres devoid of the molecular building blocks of biology. They would survive, but they would be alone. The dream of biotransference reversal would be dead forever. They would be immortal, undying, and utterly without hope. This is the future that both the hive mind and the Silent King are trying to avoid, each in their own way. The hive mind seeks to consume everything before the Necrons can deny it everything. The Silent King seeks to build defenses that will protect the galaxy's organic reserves long enough for his people to find a way to use them. It is a race against time measured not in years or decades, but in millennia. A slow-motion collision between two titans that will determine the fate of every living thing in the Milky Way. And caught between them, the rest of the galaxy does what it has always done. It endures. It fights. It struggles to survive against threats that are so far beyond its comprehension that they might as well be forces of nature. The Imperium builds its armies and fortifies its worlds and prays to the Emperor for salvation, not knowing that the greatest threat to its existence may not be the Tyranids or the Necrons individually, but the cosmic chess game being played between them, a game in which humanity and every other organic species are the pieces being moved across the board. In the deep places of the galaxy, where the light of stars barely reaches, and the silence is so profound that it has a texture, a weight, a presence of its own, the Necron tomb worlds sit and wait. Their defenses hum with ancient power. Their pylon networks broadcast their anti-psychic fields into the void. Their warrior legions stand in stasis, row upon row of living metal soldiers waiting for the command to awaken. And somewhere out in the dark, beyond the rim of the galaxy, but where the intergalactic void stretches away into distances so vast that the human mind cannot conceive of them, the Tyranid hive fleets drift. Their bioships pulse with slow, metabolic rhythms. Their organisms stir in their digestive pools. Their psychic awareness reaches out across the void, probing, searching, tasting the faint traces of biomass that drift on the solar winds between galaxies. The tendrils reach toward the Milky Way. The hive mind calculates. And when a tendril brushes against the cold, dead silence of a Necron world, it recoils. Not dramatically, not with any outward sign of alarm or distress, just a subtle adjustment in trajectory, a minor course correction, a tendril bending away from the silence and toward the noise, toward the warmth, toward the teeming billions of organic creatures that fill the galaxy's habitable worlds. The hunger moves on. The machines remain, and the galaxy turns, as it has for billions of years, indifferent to the dramas being played out within its spiral arms. Stars are born and die. Worlds form and crumble. Species rise and fall and rise again. And through it all, the two oldest forces in the cosmos continue their silent dance. The hunger that cannot be sated and the silence that cannot be consumed, circling each other in a slow, patient spiral that may take another 60 million years to resolve. So what does all of this mean for the broader galaxy? What are the implications of this peculiar relationship between the two most existential threats to life in the Milky Way? First, and perhaps most obviously, and it means that the Necrons represent a natural check on Tyranid expansion. As more tomb worlds awaken and more Necron dynasties reassert their control over their ancient territories, the areas of the galaxy that are effectively off-limits to Tyranid hive fleets will grow. Each awakened tomb world is a dead zone in the hive mind's map of the galaxy, a place where the tendrils cannot reach and the hunger cannot be satisfied. As the Necrons expand the pariah nexus and deploy more pylon networks, these dead zones will grow larger and more numerous, further constraining the Tyranids' options. This has implications for every other species in the galaxy. The Imperium, for all its vast military power, has struggled to contain the Tyranid threat through conventional means. Hive fleets have been defeated, certainly, but at terrible cost. And the victory is always temporary. The Tyranids learn from every defeat and return stronger, adapted to the tactics that stopped them before. The Imperium fights a reactive war against the Tyranids, always responding to the latest incursion, always one step behind the hive mind's calculations. The Necrons fight a different kind of war. They do not merely react to Tyranid incursions. They reshape the environment to make Tyranid incursions impossible. The pariah nexus is not a defense. It is a redefinition of the battlefield. By removing the warp from entire sectors of space, the Necrons are not just fighting the Tyranids. They are fundamentally altering the conditions under which the Tyranids can operate. This raises uncomfortable questions for the Imperium and every other organic species in the galaxy. The pariah nexus is deadly to humans too. The stilling, the numbing despair that affects all living beings within the nexus is not selective. It affects space marines and Imperial guardsmen and civilian populations just as thoroughly as it affects Tyranid organisms. The Necron's solution to the Tyranid problem is, in a very real sense, a solution that involves making the galaxy uninhabitable for all organic life, not just Tyranid organic life. This is the Silent King's dilemma, and it is a dilemma that the lore has not yet resolved. Zarek wants to reverse biotransference and restore his people to organic bodies. For this, he needs organic life to survive. But his best weapon against the Tyranids, the pariah nexus, is antithetical to organic life. He is building a weapon that, if taken to its logical conclusion, would destroy the very thing he is trying to protect. It is possible that Zarek has a more nuanced plan than simple galactic-scale warp suppression. It is possible that the pariah nexus is designed to be selective, to target specific areas where Tyranid incursions are most dangerous, while leaving other regions of the galaxy untouched. It is possible that the Silent King intends to use the nexus as a temporary measure, deployed to defeat the current Tyranid invasion, and then dismantled once the threat has passed. But none of this is confirmed in the lore. What we know is that the pariah nexus exists, that it is expanding, and that its effects are devastating to all organic life within its boundaries. The second major implication of the Tyranid-Necron relationship concerns the hive mind's strategic flexibility. The hive mind is not a mindless eating machine. It is a strategist of extraordinary sophistication, capable of planning across thousands of light years and adjusting its approach in real time based on new information. Its avoidance of Necron worlds demonstrates this sophistication clearly. The hive mind does not waste resources on unwinnable engagements. It does not throw biomass into battles that offer no return. It adapts, redirects, and finds alternative paths to its goals. This strategic flexibility means that the Tyranid avoidance of Necron worlds does not eliminate the Tyranid threat. It merely redirects it. The biomass that the hive mind does not expend on Necron worlds is instead directed toward other targets, organic targets, biomass-rich targets, targets that cannot simply shrug off a Tyranid invasion by virtue of being made of metal, Imperial worlds, Aeldari craft worlds, Orc empires. The hive fleet that turns away from a Necron tomb world does not disappear. It finds somewhere else to feed. In a darkly ironic sense, the Necron's very effectiveness at deterring the Tyranids may actually increase the danger to every other species in the galaxy. By making their own territories uninviting and unprofitable for Tyranid invasion, the Necrons are effectively funneling the hive fleets toward the galaxy's remaining organic populations. The hunger does not diminish. It merely finds new outlets. This has led some lore scholars to speculate about a potential alignment of interests between the Necrons and the Tyranids, not a formal alliance, obviously, as the two species are fundamentally opposed, but a tacit understanding. The Tyranids leave the Necrons alone. The Necrons, for the most part, do not go out of their way to intercept Tyranid hive fleets that are headed for non-Necron targets. Each side pursues its objectives without interfering with the other, and the species that suffer are the ones caught in the middle. This is, of course, a human interpretation projected onto alien minds that may not think in these terms at all. The hive mind does not make alliances. The Silent King, for all his pragmatism, considers the Tyranids an existential threat that must be defeated. But the practical effect of their respective behaviors does create a kind of accidental cooperation. The Tyranids consume the organic life of the galaxy, weakening the Necrons' potential rivals. The Necrons, by claiming territory and projecting null fields, create corridors and channels that direct the Tyranid advance away from Necron space and toward everyone else. The galaxy is caught between two forces, one that wants to eat everything and one that wants to own everything, and both of them are, in their own way, winning. There is a third implication worth considering, one that reaches into the deepest and most speculative layers of the lore. Some scholars have raised the question of whether the hive mind's knowledge of the Necrons predates its arrival in the Milky Way. The Tyranids are not native to this galaxy. They come from somewhere else, from some distant corner of the universe, so far away that the light from their point of origin has not yet reached us. But the prevailing theory is that the Tyranids have already consumed at least one other galaxy, perhaps many more, before turning their attention to the Milky Way. If that is the case, then it is possible that the Tyranids have encountered Necron-like technology before. Not the Necrons specifically, but something similar, some other ancient machine civilization that used anti-psychic technology and inorganic soldiers. The hive mind's caution around Necron worlds may not be the product of calculations made after arriving in the Milky Way. It may be the product of genetic memory, of experiences accumulated over millions of years of consuming life across multiple galaxies, of bitter lessons learned at terrible cost in conflicts that took place before the Milky Way's stars had even formed. This is speculation, of course. But the lore does not confirm or deny it, but it adds an unsettling dimension to the Tyranid avoidance of Necron worlds. It suggests that the hive mind is not merely running real-time calculations about biomass and cost-benefit ratios. It is drawing on a reservoir of knowledge and experience so deep and so ancient that it makes even the Necrons look young. The hive mind has seen things like the Necrons before, and it remembers what happened the last time it tried to eat them. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight, traveling from the deepest history of the Warhammer 40,000 universe to the cutting edge of its current narrative. We have explored the biological imperatives that drive the Tyranid hive fleets, the ancient technologies that defend the Necron tomb worlds, the psychic interference that blinds the hive mind, the weapons that unmake matter, the Silent King's desperate campaign to unite his people against the Great Devourer, and the pariah nexus that may represent the ultimate weapon in that war. The reasons why the Tyranids avoid Necron worlds are multiple and reinforcing. There is no single explanation, no simple answer to the question. Instead, there is a constellation of factors, each one sufficient on its own to give the hive mind pause, and all of them together forming an overwhelming case for avoidance. First, there is the absence of biomass. Necron worlds offer nothing to eat, no organic life, no biological material, nothing that the Tyranid digestion process can break down and reuse. A hive fleet that attacks a Necron world is investing precious biomass with no possibility of return. Second, there is the psychic null zone. Necron anti-warp technology disrupts the synaptic web that the hive mind uses to coordinate its organisms. Within the influence of a null field matrix or a pylon network, Tyranid organisms lose their cohesion and revert to instinctive behavior, becoming disorganized and ineffective. Third, there are the weapons. Necron Gauss technology and the more exotic armaments in the Necron arsenal destroy Tyranid biomass permanently, atomizing organic material in ways that cannot be reclaimed. Every Tyranid organism lost to Gauss fire is a permanent net negative for the hive fleet. Fourth, there is the resilience. Necron reanimation protocols ensure that the Necrons themselves suffer only temporary losses, while their inorganic nature means that even permanently destroyed Necrons offer no biomass reward to the Tyranids. Fifth, there is the recognition. The hive mind, through whatever combination of psychic awareness, genetic memory, and real-time analysis it employs, has identified the Necrons as a uniquely poor target. Not just unappealing, but actively dangerous, a trap that promises nothing but loss. Together, these factors create a situation that is genuinely unique in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. The Tyranids, the greatest biological threat the galaxy has ever known, have encountered something that they cannot consume, cannot adapt to, and cannot overcome through their usual methods of overwhelming force and rapid evolution. The Necrons, the oldest and most technologically advanced civilization in the galaxy, represent a hard limit on the Tyranid expansion, a wall of metal and silence against which the tide of chitin and claw breaks and falls back. It is a relationship that speaks to the deepest themes of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The conflict between biology and technology, the tension between consumption and preservation. The question of what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. In this case, the answer is simple and elegant. The unstoppable force goes around. And the galaxy, caught between the hunger and the machine, endures as it always has, grinding forward through the endless war, its fate hanging in the balance between forces so vast and so ancient that they defy comprehension. In the grim darkness of the far future, even the monsters have nightmares. And for the Tyranids, the nightmare wears a face of living metal and carries weapons that unmake the very atoms of the universe. The Necrons are not prey, yet they are the galaxy's oldest and most patient predators, waiting in the silence of their tomb worlds for the moment when they will rise and reclaim what is theirs. The hive mind knows this, and for once, the hunger chooses to look the other way. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most fascinating rivalries in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out more than you know, and it ensures you will not miss future explorations of the galaxy's darkest corners and most hidden secrets. Leave a comment below, telling me which topic you would like to see covered next, whether it is another Tyranid mystery, a Necron dynasty deep dive, or something else entirely from the vast and shadowed reaches of the 41st Millennium. Until next time, stay safe out there in the void. Yes, the stars are always watching, and some of them are older than you think.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.